Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we are going to be reviewing and talking about Taipei by Tao Lin. And as you may have noticed, I'm in a different setting than I usually am, and that is because I have moved out of my apartment in Chicago and I'm currently kind of in between permanent places, so this unusual, fairly uncomfortable setting will have to do for now. While this place works very well as like a little beach condo, it does not do well for a studio. But anyway, I digress. This book, Taipei, was one I was really excited for. I'm going to be visiting Taiwan here in a few weeks, and I wanted to read something that was set in and around the areas that I'm going to be exploring. I thought it'd be a cool way to enhance and in some ways prepare myself for the trip. In that way, I think I was a little bit disappointed with this novel, and I say that because despite the name and what you may think, the vast majority of this novel takes place in New York. Maybe 70 to 80% of it is in between New York and a road trip across the United States and Canada for the main character, Paul, who is in many ways a stand-in for Tao Lin himself, going to do a book tour. In my opinion, this book was best described in a tweet by Bret Easton Ellis, who is a writer that I think is very similar and very clearly inspires Tao Lin. But in his tweet, Bret Easton Ellis talks about how with Taipei, Tao Lin became one of the most interesting prose stylists of his generation. And that is not to say that Taipei was not a boring novel. And I think that the word boring, is pretty loaded when you're talking about literature, especially books that are more experimental by nature, which Tao Lin is, I would argue, a very experimental writer. He was a leader of the alt-lit scene that emerged in New York City. He's a spokesman, for that in the New York City, or at least a very big city urban hipster that we see super prevalent in the United States. He is a representative of that very specific group of people, that very specific movement, the early Vice people. But yeah, the novel is fairly boring, and I don't know if that's not by intention. I think that Tao Lin knew going into the novel, or knew while writing it, that it was going to be boring in a plot sense. I don't think that he worried himself with that, and I think a lot of it was intentional. And as I mentioned in the written up review of the novel, which I will link in the description below, that I wrote a few days ago, he is aiming to kind of get into the mind and explore the psyche of that hipster that we just talked about. And in doing so, we have this extrapolated viewpoint where we're looking at Paul, the narrator, Tao Lin himself, and he's going through this life. He's consuming an incredible amount of drugs. He's going to parties. He's living a life that many young people, I think, would dream of living. He's a working writer living in New York City, going on a book tour, all expenses paid. But there's a level of detachment from it. He's wandering through the world. Drugs aren't glorified in the way that I would argue Bret Easton Ellis and a lot of other writers who write similar kind of nihilistic books do, but rather they just kind of are. He's ingesting these drugs, but it's not like he's chasing the dragon, so to speak, and he's not trying to find the next high. He's just doing them to help him lubricate social situations, mostly to no success. But that is really what he's getting at here, is the jaded, apathetic, millennial, artsy type. The feelings that they go through, the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And while he does a great job at preserving a facet of the human experience that maybe isn't the most interesting to most people today, is interesting and is worth preserving, because who knows, in 150 or even 50, 20 years, if the hipster era will be fully over, and if that will be something that people look at in a way that we look at Kerouac characters on the road, and we have this aspirational longing or this nostalgia for something that we never got to experience ourselves. There might be a world, and I think that it's quite likely that there will be. It's just a matter of when that happens, where this perspective and this preservation that Tao Lin is able to achieve with this book become much more interesting. Unfortunately, that's not now. We all know what hipsters do, what they go through on a day-to-day basis. We see them. We're likely annoyed by them very often, especially if you live in a big city. And essentially the experience of reading this book is the experience of following around one of those, annoying hipsters that you might see at your local cafe in Chicago, New York, or LA. And, following them throughout their day, going to the parties that they go to, interacting with the people that they interact with. But there are moments where Lin gives us very beautiful paragraphs and phrasing. His prose is mechanical. It's I wouldn't say it's dreamlike. It's very precise and calculated. It's very similar to his Substack, which I'll also link below, where he'll go on these just crazy long and lengthy diatribes about the most mundane and seemingly pointless topics. But that is the meat and potatoes of his style, is just going on and on and on and exploring something so simple and so basic in such incredible detail that that he's able to spend 250 dense pages. There's not a ton of dialogue. I mean, there is, but there also isn't. We see a lot of pages that are like this, where it's all just massive rambling paragraphs. And I don't know what exactly was on this page that I opened up to, but if we just look at it now, let's see, all he's talking about is he's recalling the seats of vehicles and like the sizes of cups of his trip to Berlin that he did for the German edition of his novel. That's a whole page just talking about the size of these things. That is interesting. It's unlike anything I've ever read before. I think it's fresh, and it's rare that you get to read something that is so fresh, and that it's going to be fresh right from the first page. And I'm going to read you most of the opening paragraph so that you can really get a sense of what his prose style is. And I would encourage you, if you're on the fence about buying it, one, I think you should just buy it and read it. But two, if you're really on the fence, go on Amazon and look at the sample that's provided. And if you enjoy that, if you kind of are vibing with the prose style that you see there, then you're in for a great ride, because it's 250 pages of unrelenting sameness in that sense. What you see in the sample is what you get, basically. But here we go. We're on the very first chapter, page 1. It began raining a little from a hazy, cloudless-seeming sky as Paul, 26, and Michelle, 21, walked toward Chelsea to attend a magazine release party in an art gallery. Paul had resigned to not speaking and was beginning to feel more like he was, quote, moving through the universe than, quote, walking on a sidewalk. He stared ahead with a mask-like expression, weakly trying to remember where he was 1 year ago, last November, more for something to do because he wanted to know, though he was nodding curious. Michelle, to his left, drifted in and out of his peripheral vision, far enough away for pedestrians to pass unknowingly between them, like a slow, amorphous flickering. Paul was thinking the word somewhere, meditatively, as placeholder and ends, when Michelle asked if he was okay. We see this placing of phrases that don't belong in quotes quite often throughout this novel. It's really quite indicative of Tao Lin's style, and I think it stems from this, idea that we should view our lives like from above, aerially, as if it's a movie, as if it's something that's already happened. And that is how Paul, and it seems like that's how Tao Lin lives and interacts with the world around them. What's interesting is now, because I follow Tao Lin's Substack, and I find a lot of it quite interesting. I'm not going to lie, there's some that do bore me and that I skip over, just like how this book bored me at times, but I'm still glad that I've read it. I'm interested to see how his worldviews have changed post-Taipei. In this book, Paul, just himself, is this big city young hipster, more or less, trying to be a writer, kind of just succeeding at writing. Today, Tao Lin is, I don't know if I would say he's significantly more popular than then. I guess Taipei was his biggest book, but it came out like over 10 years ago, and he hasn't had like a smash hit since then. But he's a comfortable working writer, but he's since turned his back on New York City. He doesn't go often. I almost got to see him actually speak live in New York about a year or two ago, but I missed it by like 4 hours. But regardless, that doesn't matter to what we're talking about. Tao Lin now lives in Hawaii with a few cats and makes art and writes and does like nonfiction work. He does research work. And it's interesting to see this, like, this prototypical internet kid, this product of the alt-lit scene, in many ways the pioneer, or the leader of that internet age, almost, I don't know, I don't want to say turn his back on the internet, because he's still very online, but he's not really like that prototypical hipster anymore. And I think that would be interesting to be able to position his more modern viewpoints with what we get in the book. Going back to the book, one of the more interesting things that I wanted to point out and make sure that we talk about at least a little bit is how we see an accurate, or at least like a in-depth interrogation of like these experimental filmmaker, these experimental artist types, which is not super common. I took a class when I was in college about experimental filmmaking and got to spend a lot of time with people that were not dissimilar from Paul and his girlfriend Erin in the book, who continually make like these little films, quote unquote, on their MacBooks of them doing all kinds of things, ranging from doing drugs to having sex to going to McDonald's in Taipei. And while I was working in this class and we were putting on a micro cinema in like a very small Midwestern town and inviting a bunch of these really, really out there experimental filmmakers from Chicago and Philadelphia and New York to come and screen their works, I interacted with a lot of these people, and the way that he describes them and like the ideas where they think so deeply and critically about something as innocuous as clicking record on a Mac and recording themselves for 4 or 5 hours, ingesting heroin and talking about a Q&A, which is something that happens in the book, or doing heroin and going to the movie theater and tweeting while watching X-Men. These people do exist, and they do make art that is not really entertaining, but it's interesting. But it's only interesting if you spend a lot of time thinking about it and taking their goal and you almost have to like have like an artist statement about it and be like, okay, we're doing heroin and doing this because this, to see this, and then you read that and then you interact with whatever the finished product is, which usually it's pretty shoddy at best, and then you're able to use that as a vehicle to think about these questions. And really the video or the media that you're watching is just giving you time and permission to think about the ideas. His descriptions of those people is excellent, and he really does a good job at showcasing where they're balancing and kind of walking that tightrope between being full of shit and being very deep and meaningful thinkers. And so I think if you haven't been exposed to that world and are interested in it, or have been exposed to it firsthand like I have, I think you'll really, really appreciate those moments in the book. But overall, I think you need to know that going in, you very likely will get bored for large portions of Taipei. And if you are like me, looking for something that explores and investigates Taipei as a city and as a location, you certainly will be disappointed, because there is not a lot of that. There's not a lot of things that are specific to Taiwan, which there doesn't have to be. I mean, I wasn't promised that from the back cover. There's no real, meaningful description of it, and it's just from the title. I thought it would be something that it wasn't. One other last final thing to point out, which I just find to be hilarious and very indicative of Tao Lin's personality, is this quote right here, that tweet I was talking about. He cuts off the last part of it. So he just writes, "With Taipei, Tao Lin becomes the most interesting prose stylist of his generation. Period. Bret Easton Ellis." That's not the quote. The quote is what I told you earlier, where he continues on by saying, "But it's a very boring novel," which I think is funny that he's not lying to you, but you're not getting the whole truth. And yeah, I think for those reasons, this book is one that I have a difficult relationship with. It's not like that last Burroughs book I read, or the Welbeck book, where I would say I don't recommend it. This one I would recommend with very key and important caveats. I think this book is awesome for a very specific person, and I think it's terrible for others. So really think about which one of those you are before you make the decision to dive in. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today. My name is Nicholas Corcel. This is The Literary Nomad, and I'll see you shortly in the next one.